First, I want to thank everyone who helped out moving the marimba up here in the intermittent rain. So thank you again for doing that. Thank you, Professor Campbell, for being here. Thank you for being here as well, Brad. So very good. All right, excited to kind of share my research with you today. I'm going to be including some what I'm calling raw materials and quotes from Viñao from my correspondence with him via email, and he's been really great helping me out understand his work and providing us even more insight into his music. I also have a few examples using MIDI animation software to kind of provide a little bit more of a real-time demonstration of this and a different way of seeing it. That's going to help us understand a little bit of this concept of multiple time and how it is present in congregations. That software is created by Stephen Malinowski, so I just wanted to cite him. And then I'm going to be exploring musical techniques throughout the work. I'm not going to be doing a play-by-play, so I'm not going to go with variation 1, variation 2. I'm going to highlight what's important, and then at the very end, I'll play the piece, and then hopefully that will kind of string together these ideas. Great. This is Alejandro Viñao. He was born in 1951 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He studied with Jacobo Fischer while he was there. Shortly after that, he moved to London in 1975. He's been a British citizen since 1994, so that's his new home in London, England. He received his PhD in composition at the City University in London while he was there. And then also in the 1980s, Mr. Viñao worked at IRCAM, which is, of course, the electronic music mecca in France. And this is actually a picture of him at IRCAM. They're kind of experimenting, and that was obviously a big influential point in his compositional career. This is a brief look at his catalog, not just for percussion. He's written for opera and musical theater, symphony orchestra, chamber ensemble, choir, solo works such as congregations, and purely electroacoustic works, which is just for tape, no live performers. Just a few here that I pointed out, which are kind of one of his most important works outside of the percussion spectrum. The Baghdad Monologue for soprano and computer, Phrase and Fiction for string quartet and computer, Greed for 12 singers and electronics, and The World We Know, which is purely electroacoustic. It features a lot of hip-hop, pop music styles, and kind of exploring that. So as you can tell just from that, electronic music is a big part of his catalog. Every piece highlighted has some sort of computer element. This is a list of his total percussion works so far. He has a few more coming down the pike in the next year or so. His first piece was Tumblers for Marimlin. That is with Nancy Zeltzman and violin accompaniment. That also had computer as well. And then he also worked with Robert Van Cise in 1993, writing a marimba concerto. So this is kind of how he became interested in percussion, connecting with Nancy Zeltzman and Robert Van Cise. After that, Congregations is actually his third work that he wrote. So it's relatively early in his percussion writing career. And then we can go all the way through that to Water, which of course UK Percussion Ensemble played last year. That's his most recent work, percussion quintet with piano. And all of these percussion works feature these same techniques that we see in Congregations. A lot of the same thing transfers over. So hopefully by highlighting that within Con, this could easily be applied to Water or Cloak Grooves or anything else. When I asked Mr. Viñao, by the way, all these quotes that you see on the slide here, that's just in quotes, that's from Mr. Viñao himself, so it's no one else talking, just Viñao. When I asked him, why are you focusing on percussion? Why are you writing for percussion? He said, if one writes a successful piece for percussion, the piece is really successful, it can become standard repertoire. That is because the percussion repertoire is being created as we speak. If one writes an outstanding orchestral piece or string quartet, the chances it will become standard repertoire are not zero, but very close to zero. So I think he identifies the percussion world as a very fertile musical environment for his works. And I think also with his focus on rhythm, percussionists tend to adapt that and can play those things a little bit easier. With all of us playing Delacluse, we all know that percussion, especially snare drum playing, features a more intense look at rhythm than maybe some other instruments. This is a brief look at his musical style that I put together. The first thing that you need to know is that his composition revolves around rhythm first, so it doesn't start with harmony or a melody or any other larger formal structure. It's only rhythm. And also, it features this idea of multiple time. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But timings and rhythms overlaid on top of each other is very important to his work. This is also what we're going to be talking about too, multiple time and breaking it down into two moments. You have static moments in which the multiple time is stacked on top of each other. Everything's fixed. And then we also have dynamic moments. We'll talk about that. This idea of groove, how is groove important to Viñao? How does that show up in congregations? The use of accents, why he chooses to use tenuto accents versus angled accents, and how that transfers over to multiple time. Idea of echo or bouncing effect. This is basically a direct translation from his electronic work to marimbas, to live performers. And then finally, this idea of attractors, which is a little bit more of a larger formal structure evolving around rhythm. So we'll explore that. This is a formal analysis of congregations. Just looking at the bars, you can see that it's one theme. The theme is very brief. It only lasts for 3 bars total. And then we have a total of 8 variations from that. So this is just kind of showing how many bars. If you notice here, just looking at the bars, there's a little bit of an idea of exponential growth within those first 4 variations. This is further highlighted. This is also a graph done by John Francis Roberts within his dissertation only on congregations, showing the amount of time in a performance a variation would take. So we can also see there that exponential growth idea starts from the theme, goes to variation 4 and 5, and then it continues to somewhat expand. Here's the variation information, kind of what each variation brings into play. Variation 1, a triplet figure with bouncing echoes. Variation 2, secondary pulse within the bass line. Variation 3, acceleration of right hand versus a constant pulse. Variation 4, dynamic multiple time with metric modulation. Variation 5, changing speeds. That's what he refers to that variation as. A lot of times your right hand and your left hand are operating within duples, and then they move to triplets and then quintuplets. So that's the changing speed. Variation 6, repeated pitches with changing stress using tenuto markings. Variation 7, that was variation 6. Variation 7, development of an echo theme. And then variation 8, variation on variations, operating as a coda or finale to the work. All right, so first I want to talk about the con inspiration. Where does con come from within congregations? This is from Mr. Viñao. The congregations are set 8 rhythmic variations based on a traditional theme from Qawwali music, as sang by Ali Khan, and that's Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the famous Qawwali singer. The basic pulse and feel of the music has lingered in my mind ever since I first heard the recording in the early 90s. I developed each of the 8 variations, which are played as a continuous piece, exploring a different rhythmic and melodic aspect of the original theme. However, from the harmonic point of view, the piece is rather static, respecting the lack of harmony in the Western sense of the original traditional theme. I think I said that right. Here is Ali Khan, right here. So that's actually a picture of him. He would be the featured soloist singer of the group, but he would also have tabla, other traditional Indian instruments as well. And this is a short video clip just to kind of give you an idea of Ali Khan. And I also want you to hear this congregation's theme when it comes out of this performance. This is about 1 minute and 30 seconds. traditional ensemble where this theme comes from. The name of that song is called Aba Muhammad Sharyar, and it's about I believe, the Apostle Farid, so there is a religious aspect to the song. This is the traditional theme as it appears within that. And if you notice, there's only 5 pitches. There's C sharp, G sharp, A sharp, F, and E. And so these 5 pitches, some people refer to it as the Hajaz mode. For the purpose of my research, I just identify kind of 5 pitches. I don't really go into that. Here's kind of the original theme that you just heard. Structure of the song. You also notice that in the video it went to a bridge section, so it wasn't just that the entire time. So it went to a bridge, it's not just the theme the entire time, it's not really a static environment. We'll talk about the importance of that bridge and maybe how it shows up in congregations later. This is the theme as it appears within congregations. So at this point, we can start to hear the composer's hand, how he's manipulated it, the other rhythmic devices which are present. So he's slightly elongated it, but still just the same 5 pitches. Again, it only exists for 3 bars, so it's a very brief glimpse. Okay, so that's the inspiration for this piece. I'm going to do one more brief aside before we really get involved in the musical examples. This is Kalan Nankero. He is a famous, he was originally American, but he's actually an expatriate. He lived a majority of his life in Mexico. And basically his story is that when he was a youth, he was interested in the Communist Party. He went to Spain, fought in a revolution. When he came back to the United States, Nankero had trouble getting in the country. They would not let those Communist Party members come in. So he moved to Mexico, and this is also during the McCarthy hearings, so hopefully you can imagine the environment of the time. He went to Mexico, and he was inspired by Henry Cowell's New Music Resources, which is a musical treatise on the idea of rhythm and exploring more mathematical properties of music. He was mainly inspired from Henry Cowell, the idea of applying music to machines and not necessarily to by performers. And his interest lied in rhythm, and so he did this with player pianos. He actually took a stamping machine with the piano roll and would put in different lines in the bass and soprano, put in the piano, and this is how he would explore this concept of what would eventually be known as multiple time, or this idea of having multiple rhythms layered on top of each other. The music of Nankero is very much mechanical because it's played by player pianos. So everyone know what a player piano is. It's that machine you put in the piano roll, it starts going, and then no one else plays the piano, it just starts playing itself. That's what that is. And his music wasn't interested in drama, it was about just exploration and experimentation. Nankero did these experiments with player pianos in Mexico in isolation for a large part of his life, but then was discovered by Grigori Ligeti, another 20th century musical master. This is his quote about Nankero: "For me, it's the best music of any composer living today." He's Hungarian. And so Ligeti actually brought Nankero to IRCAM, again, that electronic place for exploration in France. And it's very possible that Viñao met Nankero at IRCAM. When I asked Viñao, his inspiration, for Nankero's work, this is what he told me. I have been interested in multiple simultaneous times since the late 70s. In the 80s, I realized that Nankero had explored these processes in a comprehensive and systematic way. I didn't like his music that much, but I was fascinated by his ideas and the possibility of taking them somewhere else. I felt that the processes that Nankero developed in his etudes were not very dramatic, since once the ratios between different polyphonic lines were established, their lines continued their trajectory towards a pivotal point in a more or less mechanical way, too deterministic for me, not dramatic enough. I wanted to see if it was possible to work multiple simultaneous times, but with shorter cycles so that the pivotal points were arrived at more quickly, not just towards the end of a piece or a section, and more importantly, I wanted to control how these lines converge to these points on a bar-to-bar basis. I wanted to hear the hand of the composer making choices as the process unfolded. And so it's the idea, I don't think Viñao really enjoyed Nancarrow's music, but he really was intrigued by the concepts and the ideas that Nancarrow had, and specifically applying it not just to machines, but to live performers. To me, it almost reminds me of Steve Reich when he took the phasing experiments that he did with his machines and applied that to live performers as well. It's a similar translation, and it just provides a little bit different musical output. Here's Nancarrow with his press. You can actually see him there. This was his compositional process. He did not write on stack paper. This was how he wrote his music. And he made the press himself. Okay, so let's talk about multiple time. Multiple time is a relatively simple concept. It's when you have different musical lines, it usually takes two or more, right? If we only had one musical voice, we could not have multiple times over that. So you need two or more voices, and they need to be overlapping each other, and they each suggest their own unique time signature. So they're not nestled in perfectly, they're not complementing each other, they're existing on their own individual rhythmic plane. And so I came up with this by two states in which we find multiple time in the music of Viñao. Number one is static, in which we have fixed vertical layers of musical lines existing in their own unique meters. And the defining characteristic of that is that they're fixed. They're not independent. They can't move. They're just there. And then dynamic, which is independent musical lines that can accelerate or decelerate at will. So again, not fixed, but again, this idea of multiple time happening within that. The first example of static that I have comes at the end of, I believe, variation 4 or variation 3. And it's very clear to see how he builds this, and it is a vertical layer. He starts out with this. That's in mallet 3 and then mallet 4. So if I played from the excerpt, it would sound like this. Here's the chord before that. It's a building tension using multiple time. And then just exploring this idea even a little bit more, you can hear how dense this is, right? Right? So we can't stay on it for too long. If I broke down each mallet and each voice so you could hear it, this is our downbeat. Okay? Mallet 3 is the same length, but it's just offset. Okay? Mallet 2 is a triplet. And then mallet 4 is a duple idea, 4 against 3. And the really fun thing as a listener is that you kind of shift your perspective on hearing it. Sometimes when that third voice comes in, it feels like it's in 6/8. When the other voice comes in, it feels like it's back in duple. Here's a animation of just the same process. Hopefully you can follow along. This is the MIDI animation software. So each line you see, this is a piano roll, a visual. Each line is color coded for pitch, and hopefully we can see that building layers vertically. Okay, this is a dynamic moment in which he writes out a rhythmic approximation of what he wants, but then above the bar line he writes as if accelerating against the pulse of the left hand. So this is what this one sounds like a little bit. That left hand is the fixed voice. So the right hand moves and accelerates against that independently. Here's the acceleration against the left hand. And the left hand will change too, it's not fixed either. But I'm just going to go ahead and play a little bit of this variation for you so you can hear that. I'll start a few bars before. Here is an animation to show that as well. So the left hand is static. I love these examples because you can actually see a 3D idea of it, especially the right hand, how it goes from here up to the top. There's kind of a shape to it. I love that. All right, the next idea I'm talking to you is borrowed from this theory of rhythm and meter. This is something called metrical dissonance. It's developed by Harold Krebs, a theorist, and he's basically applying harmonic principles to rhythm, specifically meter, and calling these things metrical dissonance. The first example is grouping dissonance, in which the note pattern grouping is unequal to the meter, thus creating overlap, and the pattern will shift against the meter. So if you imagine if we're in 3/4, which has 6 8 notes, and our grouping pattern is 5 8 notes, it would show 1 and 3, and so that pattern will kind of shift places each time you hear it. And then opposite of that, displacement dissonance is when the note pattern grouping is equal to the meter, but it's not at that structural downbeat. So in other words, if I had 3/4, 1 2 3 1 2 3 3 3, the grouping's the same, and we're almost creating a sense of a fake downbeat, false downbeat. Here's the first obvious example of grouping dissonance. Happens within variation 3, I believe, in the bass. It's exactly what I mentioned, that low C sharp happening on the 3/4 bar is in groupings of 5 8 notes against the traditional con variations theme. So this is what that sounds like. So that you could see the low bass in 5 8. I think this is also an interesting perspective on Viñao's music, because you could argue, why didn't he write it like this? I think he's aware of that grouping dissonance, but pretty much I'm going to play this again. I want you to see if you can feel it in 5 8. So this is going to be the downbeat. Here is that for the MIDI. And here's the low bass note. I think a lot of times he will reference that tolling bass note as a bell. He wants it to sound like a bell that's just ringing in the background, kind of against the other music. This is the displacement dissonant idea. It's whenever the bass is equal to the meter, groupings of 3, but it happens either in beat 2 or beat 3, not on the downbeat. Just like that. So my bass is still in groupings of 3, but it creates this idea that the bass is the downbeat when it's not. I'll play it one more time. So another idea, even a simple concept like that can suggest multiple time. Viñao defines it, is a repeating pattern or sequence that evokes the desire to dance or move in the listener. Therefore, a groove is locked into repetition. In Viñao's work, Arabesco Infinito, he specifically looks at grooves, this idea of tinkering with a groove to maybe change it slightly so that it's no longer fixed, but it still has this element of grooving, this danceability to it. I think the idea of groove is a really good contrast to this idea of multiple time. Multiple time, the density sometimes is unavoidable, and that one example in which I'm playing all the mallets in different lengths, we heard how dense that was. A groove, the density must be controlled to maintain the feel. It has to be able to be danced to, or to feel that you can tap your foot to it. So I think this is really interesting, and I also look at these in the idea of vertical versus horizontal. A groove is much more horizontal, looking ahead, grooving, dancing, whereas multiple time is vertical as well. The other really fascinating thing about Viñao's music is that these two concepts are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes you can have a groove with elements of multiple time and likewise. So it's really interesting to see those. When I talked to Mr. Viñao about grooves, this is what he told me. When my music is groove-based, the syntactical and structural formal procedure is different than when it is multiple times oriented. In groove-based music, the challenge is to develop the groove from bar to bar without destroying it, while changing it. That seems like a contradiction, an oxymoron. A groove must not change in order to groove, right? Well, my premise was then perhaps not necessarily so. I wanted to see if I could develop, change a groove, and still keep its identity, keep it grooving, while still tinkering with it. This is, I believe, a spot in which you can kind of see Viñao tinkering with this groove. This example is not incredibly dense, but if you look at the very end of it, in that 5/4 bar at the bottom right, you can see how the right hand starts to accelerate slightly against it. So I'll go ahead and play this. So hopefully you can hear that. It's in groupings of 3, 2, 3, and then 2, 2. So big ba 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 da da ba da. That's the groove. I'm going to play it one more time. Here's another example of a groove that comes from variation 3. This groove kind of revolves around this idea of going from D to C sharp, which is present in that original theme. So this is what it sounds like. So again, it's extremely dense. It has that danceability to it. Again, in this example, the right hand accelerates against the left. So it's going somewhere else. It's groove, and then there's an idea of multiple time or acceleration that happens. All right, this brings us to tenuto markings, which are all throughout Viñao's music. When I asked him about his tenuto markings. This is what he told me. In my percussion works, the tenuto accent is simply an accent, not quite as strong as an angled accent. The problem with instruments like the marimba is that going for an angled accent will produce a sound with higher harmonics and a brittle attack. So if I want an accent that conveys stress in order to get a groove, then you need something in between an angled accent and no accent at all. So the tenuto accent is not tenuto in the sense of held, but in the sense of louder or more stressed or heavier, but not meaning that the note should stick out of the context. Here's an example in which he uses tenuto markings within Variation 5. We can see it, how that first E flat and the bass has that tenuto marking. And I feel like within his music, specifically Kahn, he uses these tenuto markings to kind of highlight different voices that he wants to come out of texture. I'll go ahead and play this for you, just hopefully you can hear that. And I think this is a really great example. We'll see it in the MIDI visual, but I think of this variation as 4 different concepts that are happening within just the marimba. On the right hand, I have these rhythmic accompaniment. Okay, that will change throughout. In addition to that, I have this idea of growing to there's a forte and then going down, almost like within water, how tides hitting a beach, and then they kind of go back and they build up again, and then they crash, and then they build up again. So now that sounds like this. Okay, so now we have dynamics, 2 things. Within the bass, we see that same information, the bottom notes tolling like a bell. So this low C, again tolling like a bell. We see the grouping dissonance as well, that those C's in the span of 5/8 notes, just like the first example we saw. And all of the melodic information is happening within this area of the keyboard, mallet 2, with this E flat, and he uses tenuto markings to show that. Here's a visual example. You can see the tolling bell, and those lines in the middle range there are the melody. Stop that there. So hopefully you can see those 4 elements at work, how he uses the tenuto marking to show that. One of the last ideas that we're going to be talking about is this idea of echo. Viñao says the idea of bouncing and echo are very much linked together. Both ideas have to do with the way energy is dispersed or diffused. Bouncing relates to the way mallets bounce on a percussion instrument, especially on a marimba. The rhythm needs to be right, of course, to allow you to bounce. If it is too fast or too slow, it will not bounce. But assuming that the rhythm is the right type, the term bouncing will invite you as a player to control energy in a very different way. The echo is the electronic equivalent of bouncing. So whenever he says bouncing, it's the same thing as echo. This is a great example of how he uses this within congregations, and he actually notates it exactly. Measure 280 there, it says like 2 echoes bouncing out of sync, and then 2 bars later it says like 3 echoes bouncing out of sync. So it's very brief, but once you actually hear it, you can kind of hear it all throughout congregations, this idea of echo. Specifically, the 3 echoes. It's very evident once you actually see that. and how that translates to playing, how we can hear the echo. And again, this idea of echo too can suggest multiple time as well. Here's a whole variation based on echoes. It's titled Of Canonic Echoes. Within this example, he actually uses accents instead of tenuto markings to designate where the musical line is happening. The other notes, in my opinion, are a little bit of the after effect of the echo. So all of the accents are the first instance of the note, and it's like I just put an electronic echo effect on it, and then you hear it after the fact. He also uses this idea of the octave, I think the further idea of the echo. We have the first three note groupings like this. So I'm saying that this is the primary note here. It bounces once, and then this is the final echo. Okay, so I'll play this example for you. Personally, I don't believe he wants a brittle attack that he actually defined the tenuto marking. I don't think he wants a really loud sound. He just uses it to define where each echo begins. Here is that example in the video. Very much kind of like a V mountaintop shape as opposed to anything else. All right, one of the final things we're going to be talking about is the idea of voicing, and this is still regarding this idea of tenuto markings. Within variation 6, he places tenuto markings in very interesting places. I'm going to go ahead and play this for you. And the tenuto markings show up in the bass and in the highest register. This is a pretty interesting variation. So I decided to look at the appendix, which Viñao is so nice to include. This is the first draft of the work. And the first big change that you can see is that there's actually a separate soprano line with that high tessitura starting with the E's. So we can see, okay, maybe there's a few different voices happening here. How he uses the tenuto marking. He also, in this earlier draft, this is actually all in 12/8. So before it was bum, 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 bum. This would sound dum, dum, ba, da, dum, dum, dum. So again, maybe another feeling. I went ahead and kind of explored this further, and I took out those tenuto markings, and I tried to separate all the voices within this variation. So I'm going to just identify these and play them for you. This is the bass voice that you first hear. lines, we can start to hear this conjugations theme come through. And we can also see that this bass melody that goes on is very long. To contrast that, here is the soprano melody. Right here, and this is the same thing. It's very long, goes on for quite a while, has a little bit of the same characteristics. Soprano line. Hopefully you can hear the con theme within that as well. And then here, this leaves us with maybe perhaps the most interesting part, to me at least, is everything else. This is the middle voices. And I think this is a great example of, we're talking about comparing multiple time to groove. This is the groove component that kind of glues everything together. This is that middle groove. Grooves a little bit. It doesn't really go anywhere, too. It's relatively static. This brings us back to the original variations. I'm going to play it one more time for you, and I'm just asking that you try and identify each voice, the bass, the soprano, and then this kind of middle blues section here. How that determines the performance of it. Separating it, I think by doing this as a performer and using this analysis, you play it much more differently. It's no longer just a flat variation. You can actually hear this con theme happening in the bass and the soprano line. You de-emphasize everything in the middle here, and then you can further shape these lines as they appear throughout. All right, this is one of the last ideas, attractors. This is what Viñao defines as attractors. The idea of attractors appear in many of my works, perhaps not always formulated as attractors. One could say that most Western music has worked historically with attractors. After all, isn't a common cadence a type of attractor? In any dramatic system based on tension and resolution, there has to be a point towards which everything wants to converge, and by virtue of converging, it provides release to the accumulated tension. That is, in essence, how drama works. So this idea of attractors is something that Viñao, is only specific to his music. He's the only one, I believe, who uses it. And it's really, if you think about it as a rhythmic cadence, that's essentially what it is. Not using harmony or anything to release tension, but using rhythm. And this brings us back to maybe a little bit larger scale formal analysis. The attractors are the key centers here. So variations 1 through 4, the key center with the attractor is that C sharp. Everything kind of wants to come back to that C sharp. The piece starts with C sharp. The con theme starts with C sharp there. Variation 5 is a little different. There actually is not an emphasis on C sharp, it starts out with F sharp. And if you remember back to the original theme as played by Ali Khan, sang by Ali Khan, you can actually hear that he went to that bridge section. That bridge section is in F sharp. So I interpreted this, and then the final 3 variations are in C sharp as well. I interpreted this as basically saying con variations is in one of the most basic formal structures that we ever have had, fast, slow, fast. That variation 5 is very slow and goes to another key center, F sharp. It's also important to realize that F sharp is not the original key within the con variations theme, so that we must know that F sharp is special or important because it doesn't show up within the con theme at all. One more thought on attractors within this con idea. How do I know that C sharp is the attracting point for this theme? It's because everything comes back to it. It's the middle pitch within these 5 pitches that we have, and I'm either stepping up to it or falling down to it. So it's always kind of there. Pretty unique, pretty cool. And then this is an idea of attractors with rhythm. So now I'm only playing C sharps. This brings us to the final variation. And with this, we can have a little bit more accents. We can see how the accents turn into tenutos, right? And it's the idea of this rhythm, the energy within this rhythm of the attractors being dispersed and then coming back to the top. So it sounds like this. So now just using pure rhythm and energy to get us back to that common theme that we can hear there. All right, so this is the final part of my presentation today, performance practice. Now with a deeper understanding of all the complex rhythmic processes of con, how does this affect our performance of it? And I like to think back to that comparison with Nankero. Nankero was extremely formulaic. He was interested in experimentation, concepts. He would write an entire piece based on one concept. So he's not really interested in telling a narrative or providing musical drama. And he only worked with machines. Viñao took this, applied this to humans, and made this much more dramatic. How does this affect the performance of it? For me, what I struggle with the most, and I think what most people struggle with when they play this, is this idea of representation versus interpretation. How do I represent the composer? How do I play all the rhythms completely accurately? How do I transfer everything on the page so that you can hear it in the audience, but also have some room to interpret it as an artist and to kind of put my touch on it? This is just kind of one brief example of a page in con variations, and I just kind of tallied up all the information on this page. We have 30 dynamic markings, 17 crescendos and decrescendos, 14 accents, 23 tenutos, and 8 different meters in which we play this. So for me, it's the representation is hard. How do I just accomplish that and play that by itself without adding anything to it? So this brings us to kind of my performance practice rules, or a few ideas I came up with. Number 1, the beginning piece, we strive to play everything on the page: phrasing, accents, dynamic markings. This is extremely difficult with con, as we saw in just that last slide. Number 2, question if musical phrasing, specifically manipulation of tempo, detracts or enhances the integrity of Viñao's use multiple time. For example, if my right hand is supposed to be accelerating, the last thing I want to do is to take time and slow down, because it's going to seem like it's not going anywhere. Does that make sense? I'm going to be fighting myself. And then the final rule I have is that understand that a successful performance lies within the effectiveness of communicating the score to a wider audience, communicating this score to you, and how that actually comes across. I also included that last bit, not just other percussionists. I know we live in a YouTube culture. I know that I'm not sure how many people have actually played this in an audition here at UK, but it's one of the most performed marimba pieces that we have. And it really, once you dig into it, it's probably one of the most musically rich pieces we have as well. And so how do we communicate that to an audience? And how do we, if anything, highlight this work to show that the marimba is, on par with other instruments? I think the great thing about congregations is that I could take that score and I could play it on a piano and it would sound like really good music. And not a lot of marimba pieces can do that. So this is a listening suggestion from Mr. Viñao that he gave. The magic in music with multiple times is that in spite of the layers appearing to not belong together at the same time, they finally arrive at a place where it is shown that they did belong together, and that they were traveling together towards the same destination, albeit following very different routes, seemingly completely independent routes. So he actually compares this to trains leaving the station and trains taking different tracks, but still getting to the same place. So when you actually listen to this run of congregations, maybe find a voice that's speaking to you, follow it, and see where it goes, and kind of marvel at the fact that it does kind of go together. So with that being said, I'm going to take just 2 seconds and move a few things, move the marimba closer, and then we'll kind of perform.